This time I'm playing with the top leaderboard Grandmaster Parlox. The competition consists of 6 games. You get 1 point by winning going first, 2 points by winning going second. The player who at the end has the biggest amount of points, wins the competition. And the first game is United States with World Domination. This is how our territory setup looked like. I didn't have a single place to put my army to in which I would be able to access all of my opponent's territories, so I had to think which spot would be the most important for me to cover. In this blizzard making these 2 continents with only 1 border to guard, I decided to place my army to that territory. And after the reveal with my opponent adding his army to this territory, I wasn't able to crush it, but on the other hand my opponent didn't have the access to it either. So what I decided to do is to capture some territories without unleashing my opponent's army, and obviously capturing these 2 one-border continents with splitting enough troops to properly guard them. Or at least I thought so. As my opponent was actually able to break through it with getting a good manual roll and then a favorable blitz roll. So that was a big mistake for me to not split more troops to guard that continent. But my thought behind not doing that was because I didn't want to block a lot of my troops. But next time I should obviously know better. But luckily for me my opponent made a major mistake as well, of leaving his army blocked. I think if he had fortified his army next to my army, then it would have immediately guaranteed him the win, but with him not doing so, that gave me some chances to make a comeback, especially when I could just recapture that continent and attempt on guarding it for another time again. I captured the Pacific coast as well, so my opponent would have to add troops next to it, and with that he wouldn't have enough troops for the one border continent, and another reason is to have more territories in overall. My opponent then took the Pacific coast from me and with his biggest army captured a bunch of territories, fortifying it next to my one border continents. Next turn he was able to invade and take them from me. I failed to invade the most upper continent, and with my opponent already being in a good territories lead, the game was basically over for me. After first game the result becomes 0-2 with my opponent being in the lead. The second game is Brazil capital Conquest. My opponent as his first pick selected the territory of Mato Grosso do Sul, so to have an opportunity to capture and try properly guarding the continent of Sul. And I selected the territory of Goiás, which is another amazing territory for your capital. And then my opponent immediately followed with the territory of Mato Grosso, so in case I don't put my capital on Goiás or so, then by placing his capital on Mato Grosso, he could capture the 6-troop region having only 1 non-capital border to guard. But with me placing my capital on Goiás it wouldn't work out, because I would be always able to simply invade him into the 6-troop region by attacking the territory of Tocantins. When it comes to the territory selection, my major mistake was to not pick the territory of Espírito Santo, as it's the best territory for me to pick in the Sudeste region to block my way towards the continent of Sul the least. So in the further territories picking I really tried to pick the territories in the way to not end up blocked from the Sul region. But my opponent understood that, and with that he didn't let me to achieve that. So because of that I had to do the army split in the territory of Minas Gerais, so with my opponent crushing that army, he would unlock my capital's way towards the region of Sul. To put my army to the territory of Santa Catarina would have been a blunder, because with my opponent crushing that army there, my capital army would have been still blocked. My opponent got the 3 troops advantage when crushing that army, but honestly it's nothing in comparison to make my army blocked and let my opponent hold the region of Sul. So while my opponent was happy to crush my army, I think I was happy even more, as 3 troops isn't that much, the position matters much more. So as you saw, I invaded him into the region of Sul, leaving some troops in it, and captured the Nordeste region, so he would be forced to invade it, and with that he couldn't properly focus on the region of Sul. And then I continued going on with the same strategy, so just without forgetting about my capital's safety as well, as I knew that my opponent, by seeing that he is losing, would just immediately blitz my capital any moment I would leave it too weak, so I prioritized the safe but smart play. I didn't need to drastically expand or leave a bunch of troops on the continent's borders I was trying to guard, because I knew it could have really backfired me. Luckily for my opponent here, he got a set at 3 cards in that turn, and with getting super lucky blitz rolls and manual rolls, he was able to compensate some of his troops he lost before when trying to invade me into the Nordest region. But I had a set at 3 cards as well, so I just continued with my plan. But my opponent got lucky to invade me here again with a lucky 3 versus 2. I thought I was really going to be in the advantage, but after those turns the situation started to really even out. So the situation was kinda stalemating and we were just prioritizing our capital's safety. Until I tried to go for the continent again. And this is how the situation looked. Luckily for me, my opponent didn't have a set at 3 cards, as 20 troops from the set combined with 5 troops he has gotten would have been a 61 versus 29 blitz roll, which is 92%. So next turn I realized that it was very dumb for me to leave these 12 troops, and with that I fortified them on my capital back. Right here, if trading in a set, I would have had 56% chance to blitz my opponent's capital, but with me being into the advantageous position and with my opponent not having favorable chances to blitz my capital, I obviously didn't take it. So then, as you can see, we continued making attacks, and then at this moment I've got to trade in a set at 3 cards for the 91% capital hit. So to increase the chance even more, I brought my secondary army firstly, though for some reason capturing one unnecessary territory, but the manual rolls were good, and with that it became 100% chance success victory. I even out the result and it becomes 2-2. The third game is Supermax Prison World Domination. This is how our territory setup looked like. And since in the most games I played other Grandmasters used 2 counter-attack armies next to 2 for me suitable to go for continents, I just decided to add almost all of my troops to only one of the continents, and I decided to go for the second hardest one from all of the 3. Just putting a smaller army to the easiest for me to go suitable continent. And actually I was really surprised that my opponent put his army next to that exact continent I was going for, but probably makes a lot of sense, because if I had gone for any other continent, then he would have captured and properly guarded this continent with his biggest army. I decided to immediately blitz my opponent's army, and I've got a very lucky blitz roll of losing 7 troops fewer. Then I tried doing these manual rolls, which went absolutely terrible for me. So actually maybe I shouldn't have even used them. But I found out that my opponent just rage quit the game, which I think was a pity decision, because I think he might have been able to make a comeback, like if trying to go for these 2 continents. Anyway, with my opponent surrendering, the result becomes 3-2 with me being in the lead. The fourth game is France capital Conquest. And with these blizzards, the southern France having only one border to guard, obviously I was going to pick the Languedoc-Roussillon territory as my first territory pick, so for it to be my capital. And my opponent picked the territory of Burgundy, so it would be his capital, and that he could capture eastern France with one non-capital border to guard, or with 2 borders in total. Then I went with the territory of Picardy, while my opponent with the territory of Riviera, so that it would probably end up being blocked from my capital and he would deploy his troops there, so might even it would be his capital spot to counter me with a smaller army. But I would say that was a blunder. He gave me the 2-troop continent bonus, but don't get me wrong, it could be worth to give your opponent a bonus in order to get a better position, but my point is that I could easily counter his plan by avoiding to select these 2 territories until my opponent selects one of them himself, so with that these troops he planned to add here wouldn't become blocked from my capital. This is how our setup looked at the end. I obviously put my capital as that one border continent's border, and then left another smaller army next to my opponent's continent, since I knew he was going to try properly guarding it. But honestly I should have added quite more troops than that. So I would say that was a blunder for me. My opponent then tried to manual roll and blitz that army, but he wasn't really successful with that. but despite that he still had a proper amount of troops left on his non-capital border, meaning that I just have to use my main capital's army in order to successfully invade it, but with that to end up making my capital blocked. So with that I decided to make a lot of these troop splits, so my opponent would have to waste a lot of troops, and with that would end up not having a proper amount of troops to guard his non-capital border if he doesn't want to leave his capital relatively weak. And honestly, I'm very happy that my opponent decided to crush these smaller armies, because it just guaranteed for me that he won't be holding his continent. Luckily for me, his blitz rolls weren't really successful. He was losing like the same amount of troops. Then I tried to continue executing my plan by capturing these territories. And when the fourth turn came, I traded in a set, getting a 100% chance blitz roll to blitz his capital. And after 4 games the result becomes 4-2 with me being in the lead. The 5th game is Jules Verne's mysterious island World Domination. This is how our territory setup looked at the end. And I was able to create a spot which my opponent wouldn't be able to access, so unless he would like to risk getting his whole army blocked if not predicting me right. And with the reveal, my opponent didn't have the access to crush my army, so he just ended up capturing some territories but without capturing the ones which would unleash my biggest army towards his biggest army. I didn't want to make myself accessible towards my opponent too, so I captured some territories. And then with splitting my troops into 3 different armies, I tried to guard the 3 troops continent. Which I will say turned out to be a mistake, as my opponent brought me down to fewer territories than I did, and then to counterattack my 3 troops continent he captured the 4 troop continent, which with these blizzards had only 2 borders. Unfortunately, with my opponent capturing the bottom left continent as well, I couldn't have added my Gotten troops on one of the armies of 7s, as then I would have probably not ended up invading that bottom left continent. The bottom left continent were 3 troops, but if prioritizing to invade my opponent to the 4 troops continent, then I wouldn't have captured as many territories, and with crushing his army I would have unleashed another his guarding army. So I just decided to capture as many territories as possible and fortify all of my troops from the blocked places. Unfortunately, my opponent got a very favorable blitz roll here of losing even 4 troops fewer. But myself, I've got a very favorable blitz roll to invade him into his continent with 5 versus 3 blitz roll of losing no troops. But then my opponent was able to capture a ton of territories, and with me ending up being with only 15 territories, I knew that I would lose the game even if I successfully invade him into all of his continents, but I failed to invade one of them. And with me not even having a set at 4 cards, I knew that the chances for me to win this game became absolute 0. So after 5 games the result becomes 4-3 with my opponent getting closer to me. The 6th game is Africa with World Domination. And this is how our territory setup looked at the end. I didn't have a place to add my army to which would have access to all of the important my opponent's territories, so I had to make a choice. And I decided to put my army to this territory, because I noticed that these 2 territories could make me or opponent to hold these 2 continents with only 2 borders to guard. So my priority went into that. And I predicted my opponent right. I've got a very lucky blitz roll to crush my opponent's army with losing even 6 troops fewer, and with that I took over both of these mentioned continents. But my opponent got very lucky blitz rolls to crush these armies made of 3s. But despite that I was still in a very good territories lead, so just capitalized on my advantage on trying to capture as many territories as possible. My opponent wasn't able to recapture many, and with that it was more than obvious that I win this game. So the final result becomes 5-3 with me winning the series. Now for more 1v1 competitions click on the playlist on the right, and for more 1v1 strategy tips click on the playlist on the left.